now. I'm going to try something different by using a whiteboard in between. Again, I suggest that you have the PowerPoints with you because this is a video. So in the PowerPoints, you can go through them and you can click on things and move them around, go back and forth. For the video, you can just hit pause occasionally. All right, so let's go ahead and start going through this. I'm going to break it up into bits as well because I don't know how long YouTube I can save. So we've done a lot about pollution and things like that. We've talked about energy a little bit, so let's go through energy and what energy actually is. All right. So energy is defined as the ability to do work. This is something that we talked about a long time ago in a very early lecture. The SI, the official unit of science, is called a joule. That's what a joule is. It's about the amount of energy. If I was to lift up, say, a wad of keys about a meter in the air, that's how much energy a joule is. A joule is not very much energy. The old unit is the calorie, and those of you in the lab have dealt with calories. So a calorie is based on water. It's the temperature, the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. A kilocalorie is a nutritionist calorie. That's what you see on food labels. Right. Just some examples. We've talked about potential energy and kinetic energy. So you might want to review for yourself. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Potential energy is when something has the potential to do energy. So these are all different types of energy, and we can look at those, but you can go through this slide. Power is a little bit different. Power is energy over time. And so the reason we bring this up in this class is because you have power bills, and your power bills will give you energy in watts or kilowatts. So remember, the prefix kilo means 1,000, and if you want to remember it, how do you kilowatt? The answer is 1,000 times. I know you missed the jokes. All right, so for example, your power bill, energy is given to you in kilowatt hours. So if you do the math, an hour is 3,600 seconds. A kilowatt is 1,000 watts, so 1,000 joules per second. So a kilowatt hour is about 3.6 million joules, which again seems like a lot, but a joule is a very small amount of energy. All right, just some other examples to give you a feel for it. We've talked about this already. You can read through this. Electric heater with a heating element might use 1 kilowatt, right? Those types of things. So if you want to convert it to calories, there's a joule is 4 calories. I'm sorry, a calorie is 4 joules. Interestingly, and you can read through this slide as well. Okay, power is the rate at which energy is generated. Interestingly, we can take a moment and digress and talk about calories. So a calorie on a food label, why do we count calories? This is where you can think about that for just a moment. But in general, people who are counting calories, or they have a Fitbit, that's measuring how many calories they burn, and yet a calorie is something that we talk about as being in food. So calorie is energy that's released by chemical bonds in the molecules in food. So again, those of you in the lab, we did a lab experiment where we burned some Cheetos, and we were able to use the energy from burning Cheetos to heat water and determine how many calories were in there. So the first law of thermodynamics is actually what the diet industry doesn't want people to know. We call this law the law of conservation of energy. That's also the first law of thermodynamics. And remember, we talked about this at the beginning of the semester. All right, energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can change form. So think about some different types of energy. All right, so some different types of energy. Let's go to we can go to the board for that. All right, so some different types of energy. If I can find this, I have to click on it. There it is. So there's mechanical. That would be moving an object. Excuse the writing. There'd be electrical. Right, that's from electrons moving around. There's chemical. And chemical energy is from breaking and forming chemical bonds. And when you're counting calories, right, that's what we're really looking at. So energy is released by breaking chemical bonds in food, that energy can be used by your body to make new cells, to heal wounds, to work on your immune system in the case of this virus that's going around, to move muscles, all sorts of things like that. And if whatever energy isn't used, your body stores it by forming chemical bonds. So there's all sorts of types of energy. There's solar, right? There's all sorts of different types. And again, we talked about this before. Let me erase this for later. We talked about this before in the context of conservation of energy at the beginning. And if you think about where did my energy come from, the energy I got came from food I ate, which came from a plant, which may have come from, or if I ate an animal, it came from an animal that ate a plant, which eventually, tracing it back, comes from the sun. So you can really trace most of the energy back to the sun. There's also nuclear energy, and we'll talk about that as well. All right, even in terms of this, this pandemic. So those of you sitting at home, which is most of you, if you should become ill, I hope you don't, but the most important thing to remember, and we talked about this when I talked about the immune system, is your immune system uses a huge amount of energy, because if you recall when we talked about this, you have to make a whole bunch of new cells. Cell division requires a lot of energy. Producing antibodies, antibodies are proteins. Producing antibodies requires a large amount of energy. So that's why when you're sick, you feel tired, because your immune system is using a lot of energy to produce the cellular response and the humoral response. So keep that in mind. If you get sick, whether it's from COVID or from the flu or just getting a little head cold, if you're sitting around and laying down, that means your body can use that energy to fight off the infection. If you're running about and doing all sorts of other things, that means your body is spending the energy on something else. And stress also requires a lot of energy. So these are all things to think about, and the first law of thermodynamics is huge. In addition, the bottom line is that the amount of energy you bring in, that's it. And the amount of energy that, if you bring in more energy than you use, your body is going to store it. All right. So this is some of the types of energy that I just listed. I use these slides once a semester. All right. So let's talk about how electricity gets to our homes. All right. So how do we generate electricity? So this diagram it will show you, and in general, I'm going to kind of go through it. Let me see what the next slide is. All right. So in general, you can look at the next slide in a minute. But in general, it starts with burning some type of a fossil fuel or coal or something of that nature, right? And that is energy. That is, what type of energy is that? That's right. That's chemical potential energy or chemical energy. Typically, you're taking heat, you heat water, you turn it into a gas. Gas goes up through a tube or whatever and turns turbines. Now, what generates electricity is if you take a coil of metal and you spin it inside of another coil of metal, there's kind of an internal friction there, and that pulls electrons off of metal atoms, and those electrons moving through the wires, right, when you start moving electrons around, that's electrical energy. And so really, most electricity is generated by something turns a turbine, except for solar. So in this case, burning a fossil fuel turns liquid into a gas. The gas turns turbines. That spins coils of metals around each other, which generates electricity. Then it goes to transformers, which just change the voltage and the current. Then that gets into the wires into your home. This slide just summarizes it. Okay, and the potential energy is the potential energy from chemical bonds, getting made into kinetic energy, moving molecules around when you turn the liquid into a gas like boiling water. The mechanical energy would be the turning of the turbines, and then electrical energy. And we've talked about this before. When you burn fossil fuels, what do you get? You get some types of air pollution, right? You get incomplete combustion, you get greenhouse gases, all sorts of things like that. Now let's think about what else can be used to turn a turbine. Okay, so you hit pause, maybe think about that, jot down an idea or two. I'm going to just give you time to hit pause, then I'm going to the next slide. All right, well actually the next slide doesn't talk about that, so let's do that. Let's see, where does energy come from? It comes from combustion, right? We've talked about methane combustion before, and we've done the balanced equation. Okay, it takes energy to break the bonds in reactants, so energy is released when bonds form product. All of this stuff I've actually talked about already. So, but when chemical bonds are broken, we've talked about chemical bonds before. You can think of chemical bonds as being like rubber bands. If you break a rubber band, it makes a noise, right? It hurts a little bit too. All of that is energy that's released. If less energy is released than is needed to break bonds, if more energy is released, then some of that energy is used as heat, released as heat, and so on and so forth. All right, these are just some examples of bond energies, just to give you a feel for how much energy can be contained in a chemical bond. In a class like Chem 201, because I know you guys are all changing your majors, you'll do the math on this stuff. All right, this is a good stopping point, so I'm going to stop here for part 1. Be back in a few minutes for part 2, or in however long it takes you to load it up.